The valley was nameless still, though its rolling meadows and dark spruce forests would soon bear the name Eden. The land, set a day's hard ride from the nearest township, was pitched in sermons as fertile, untouched, and destined for the righteous. 11 families answered that call, gathering wagons and livestock, and trailing their hopes across rough earth toward a sanctuary they were told could endure 100 years. They arrived with hymnals, with seed, with iron tools that rattled with every turn of the wheels. Most of all, they arrived with conviction that faith and labor would carve heaven out of wilderness. The promise was spoken plainly here, far from the debts of cities and the governance of county men. The chosen could live as one body under God. They laid foundations before they had proper roofs. The first structure raised, even before homes were framed, was a small wooden chapel. Reverend Elias Moore, not yet 30, stood on its stoop the first Sunday and declared that Eden would not only survive, it would thrive, a shining model of purity for the age to come. His words rang over voices hoarse from work and hands blistered by stone and pine. In that moment, to hear him was to believe it might be true. The contrast lay in what followed. Though we name it Eden now, the settlement would be remembered, not for the harvest promised, but for what was lost. 10 years on, every family had vanished. Every structure collapsed or burned, save that one chapel, its steeple still standing in an empty field, a silhouette against grey sky. The claim is not embellishment, but fact preserved in county archives. Eden rose as a haven, and within a decade it was a grave. Before continuing, a note must be spoken. What follows is a reconstruction drawn from journals, depositions, and reports, not all complete, some redacted, many suppressed. It is told with respect to the dead, with care for descendants who may still carry their names, and with recognition that history can wound. For listeners sensitive to accounts of famine, disappearance, and religious extremity, discretion is urged. Eden began as promise, but its story is a ledger of contrasts. Faith set against fear, sanctuary built against wilderness, hope tilled against soil that gave little back. To understand why only the church remained, we must return to that first spring, when voices still sang together and families still believed they had arrived in paradise. Before stepping further into the record, it is worth pausing. What you are hearing is not simply a tale of vanished families. It is a mirror held to our own age. Eden's story was once confined to the valley, whispered in sermons and noted in fading ledgers. Now it reaches you, wherever you sit, whether in the hush of night on a long drive, or at a kitchen table lighted by screens the settlers could never have imagined. Their world was one of isolation, of voices carried only as far as the next cabin. Yours is a world bound by distance, yet linked by breathless transmission. So before we proceed, I ask you directly, where are you listening from? Tell us, because in offering your place, you stitch yourself, if only faintly, into the same map those families once drew. It is a deliberate act to bridge then and now. For while the founders of Eden sought fellowship in a single clearing, you are part of a fellowship that spans continents. Consider the contrast. They built walls to keep wilderness at bay. You open windows to connect with strangers. And yet, both acts are gestures against loneliness. Their hymns rose only to treetops. Your voices echo across cables, across oceans. There is another purpose in this moment. Stories such as these can pull like undertow, tempting us to treat tragedy as spectacle. It must not be so. The families of Eden were flesh, not archetype. They hungered, prayed, quarreled, and dreamed as any do. What is shared here has been shaped from fragments, letters torn at the edges, depositions copied by hand, reports filed and then sealed. These are reconstructions, never the total truth. Out of respect for those silenced, nothing here should be mistaken for entertainment alone. So we ask again gently, where do you stand when you listen? In a city bright with light, or in a countryside not so unlike the one where Eden stood? Wherever it is, know that you are looking back into a valley once alive with promise, soon to be shadowed with loss. That act of listening itself is a kind of witness. You are not removed from their fate. You are invited to carry it forward. The spring thaw revealed the valley in its true Shape, broad pasture along the river's bend, hemmed by dark ridges of pine and granite. It was here that the 11 families staked their claim. Each family bore a name that had weight in the towns they left behind: Bennett, Caldwell, Price, Harker, Ellison, Grant, Wilkes, Dunn, Carter, Lowell, and Moore. They were not all of one mind, nor of equal means. Some brought wagons heavy with iron tools and seed sacks stitched in burlap. Others arrived with little more than hymnals and hope. What bound them together was the conviction that Eden would be free of the debts, the taverns, and the worldly distractions that plagued their former communities. The first council was held under open sky. Reverend Elias Moore, the youngest of the group but already their spiritual compass, read aloud from Genesis, "And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden." His voice was steady, his eyes bright with zeal. By consensus, the settlement took that name. It was not merely symbolic. To call their clearing Eden was to bind themselves to the belief that this harsh land could be shaped into paradise, if only their faith and labor held firm. The Reverend was not elected mayor nor sheriff, but his pulpit in the unfinished chapel quickly became the center of gravity. Still, practical needs pressed in. Benjamin Carter, a former millwright, began drawing plans for a sawmill by the river. The Lowell brothers, veterans of the last war, took responsibility for cutting timber and setting perimeters. Women like Martha Caldwell and Ruth Ellison organized the younger. Children into tending gardens while the men broke ground for homes. There was talk of fairness, of shared harvests, of each family contributing equally. On paper, each household was to receive a plot of equal measure, and the mill and chapel would be common ground. But already, notes in private journals hint at strain, resentments over who worked harder, who received more boards for their cabin, who seemed more favored in the Reverend's sermons. The contrast between ambition and flaw was sharp, even in these first weeks. Outwardly, Eden seemed united. Voices rose together in hymn. Tools rang in rhythm. Prayers closed each day. Inwardly, old habits and private pride began to show. The Bennetts whispered that the prices were too quick to barter. The Harkers kept to themselves, their lanterns burning late into the night. And Reverend Moore, though admired, began to record in his private book that the wilderness itself was testing them, that only the pure would prevail. His words, written in neat hand, survive as one of the earliest artifacts of Eden. Here we stand, on the edge of promise. Yet already I sense the serpent moves among us. To settlers eager for renewal, the valley appeared boundless with potential. But every acre cleared came at the cost of backbreaking labor. Every furrow plowed revealed soil thin and stony. What they called Eden was no gentle garden. It was a land that demanded blood and patience, and it would give back only grudgingly. In that fragile beginning lay the seed of everything that would follow, the dream of 11 families, and the shadow of the church already stretching long across their fields. The first winter arrived earlier than the families expected. By October, frost clung to the edges of the river and the pine branches, bent under weight of snow that should not have come so soon. Cabins were still half finished, walls patched with tarred canvas, roofs leaking with every storm. Men who had once spoken with pride of their strong backs now shivered in thin coats, and women wrapped their children in quilts meant for beds, pressing them close to the hearth. The settlement had dreamed of overflowing granaries, but the summer's soil had yielded only sparse harvests, corn stunted, beans shriveled, wheat eaten through by worms. When the last wagon of flour was opened, the families realized how little stood between them and hunger. Inside the chapel, however, there was warmth. Reverend Moore had insisted it be the first completed structure, its rafters tight, its hearthstone large enough to heat the whole room. Night after night, families crowded into the pews, not only for prayer but for survival. The contrast was unmistakable. Outside the walls, the wilderness howled with wolves and bitter winds. Inside, lamplight flickered across hymnals, and voices rose to drown out the cold. It was here that the Reverend's influence deepened. Bread and broth prepared at the chapel table were distributed first to those who stayed for prayers. Soon the building was not only sanctuary for souls, but the storehouse for the meager common supply. The sheriff, a quiet man named Samuel Wilkes, had kept ledger of the provisions. His notes, later found smudged but legible, recorded the decline. By December 12th, only 5 barrels flour remain, 6 sacks meal, salted pork down to a quarter. He argued for strict rationing. But in practice, it was the reverend who decided who received what. Families began to notice that those who arrived late to worship received thinner bowls, smaller cuts. To some, this felt natural, obedience rewarded. To others, it bred resentment, whispered in corners of draughty cabins. Children fell sick as the weeks dragged on. Coughs rattled through the chapel during prayer, and fevers spread quickly in the crowded pews. Reverend Moore spoke of trials in the wilderness, of the Israelites wandering, of purification through hardship. His words, spoken with conviction, turned the misery into a kind of proof. They were chosen, and chosen must suffer. Yet in the journals of Martha Caldwell, one of the few mothers whose writing survived, we read a quieter truth. I have never known such cold. Our breath freezes upon the blankets. The little ones cry through the night. If God listens, he is silent. By late January, the settlement was divided not by fences or distance, but by trust. Some leaned more fully into the reverend's vision, convinced that to survive they must cling closer to the chapel, to prayer and to obedience. Others muttered that faith did not fill a stomach or mend a frozen roof. The valley pressed hard against them, each storm erasing paths, each night stretching longer, and in that crucible of frost and hunger, the balance shifted. The church, once a beacon of unity, was becoming something else. The lifeline every family depended on, and the lever through which power would begin to turn. The snow was still deep when it happened. One evening, after a long day spent hauling wood and mending the chapel roof, families gathered for prayer. The pews were crowded, the air warm with the smell of smoke and wool. Children pressed between their parents. Among them was little Sarah Ellison, 7 years old. Hair tied back with a faded ribbon her mother had brought from town. She sang with the others, voice high and clear, then laid her head on her mother's lap as the reverend's sermon stretched into the night. When the benediction ended and the families rose to step back into the freezing dark, Sarah was gone. At first, no one panicked. Children sometimes slipped outside to play in the snow or chase one another in shadows. The men lit torches, laughing nervously, calling her name into the tree line. But as the minutes turned into hours, laughter gave way to silence. Tracks in the snow showed her small boots had wandered toward the frozen river, then vanished as if erased. No drag marks, no animal prints, just an end. Mothers gathered their children close, whispering prayers, while men pushed further into the woods until the cold drove them back. By dawn, fear was no longer avoidable. Sarah's mother, Ruth, who wrote in her small diary, her words survive only in fragment. But they tell of despair. They tell me she wondered that she will be found when snow melts. But I saw her ribbon lying in the frost near the chapel door. I know she was taken, though none will say it. The ribbon, later tucked between the diary's pages, was the only artifact preserved from that night. The Reverend preached the following: mourning that the child's disappearance was a trial sent from God, a summons to purer faith. He warned that doubt and sin invited the serpent into their midst. Some nodded in agreement, desperate to believe the loss was part of a divine plan. Others shifted uneasily in the pews, their grief too raw to find comfort in parables. Sheriff Wilkes ordered another search, but his men found nothing. No hole in the ice, no signs of beasts. In his log he scrawled a simple line: "The girl is gone." No sign, unnatural. The contrast between innocence and suspicion sharpened overnight. A child once known, for skipping stones at the river, was now the axis of fear and accusation. Some whispered that the Harkers, who kept to themselves, knew more than they said. Others muttered of witchcraft, of punishment for hidden sins. In the cabins, shutters were barred earlier. Children kept from straying, even in daylight. The valley no longer felt vast and promising. It felt claustrophobic, haunted by an absence no one could explain. The disappearance was the first real fracture. where hunger and cold had tested them. Sarah's vanishing drove a splinter through the fragile trust that bound Eden together. It was no longer only the wilderness they feared. It was each other. Spring thaw had only just begun when the second calamity struck. The mill, half pride and half necessity of the settlement, had been completed the previous summer under Benjamin Carter's design. It stood at the river's bend, its wheel turning slow but steady through the frozen months, a symbol that industry and survival could coexist with prayer. It was more than a building, it was promise, flour for bread, timber cut fine enough to raise new homes, proof that Eden could stand on its own. On a night in late March, smoke was seen rising against the stars. By the time men reached the bank, the mill was already ablaze. Flames leapt into the sky, reflected red across the thawing river. Sparks riding the wind toward the dark tree line. Families rushed from their cabins, children clutching blankets, women weeping as their husbands tried to form bucket lines. But the fire was too strong, too sudden. Within an hour, the mill's timbers collapsed inward, sending a roar across the water. The smell of pitch and scorched grain lingered for days. No cause could be agreed upon. Some swore the lantern left by a careless worker had tipped. Others pointed out that the doors had been barred from within, though no man admitted to it. Sheriff Wilkes inspected the ground the next morning. In his ledger, still preserved with soot stains, he wrote, "No tracks to or from the mill. Snow unbroken. Fire began at center, not hearth. Conclusion, no natural cause observed. The absence of footprints, the lack of clear explanation, deepened the unease already seeded by Sarah's disappearance." In the chapel, Reverend Moore thundered that the fire was God's judgment against hidden corruption. He declared that Eden must root out sin or be consumed. To those starving on dwindling stores, his words gave both terror and a kind of order. But others whispered that it was too convenient, that the destruction of the mill placed yet more power in the church, which now controlled the only secure storehouse of food. The contrast was stark. Fire as tool of progress, meant to power their survival, had become fire as weapon of destruction, stripping them of independence. Journals from that spring record bitterness taking hold. Martha Caldwell wrote, "The men argue in whispers now, even in prayer. Some say the Reverend means to keep us on our knees. Others dare not speak against him, for fear their children will starve." The mill's ashes remained black upon the riverbank, a monument to loss, and where once the settlement had sung hymns of gratitude at the wheels turning, now they spoke in hushed tones of curses, of unseen hands at work. The burning of the mill was not merely the loss of a building. It was the second mark in a pattern. First, a child gone without trace. Now their industry reduced to ash. The promise of Eden was thinning. What was left to bind them together was not prosperity, nor shared labor, but the chapel's shadow, growing darker with each passing month. By midsummer, the valley echoed not with hymns or the steady cut of saws, but with the cries of dying animals. What began with one farmer's cow grew into a plague that swept through nearly every pen and pasture. Calves that had been the family's pride stumbled on weak legs, foam at their mouths, eyes clouded white. Chickens collapsed mid-stride, feathers clinging damp to their sides, while hogs turned restless, biting at their troughs before collapsing into silence. Within weeks, half the livestock was gone. The settlers had expected hardship from the land, but this was different. They could mend a leaking roof, ration flour, even share firewood in blizzards, but when beasts sickened, there was no remedy. The visiting doctor from the neighboring county, summoned in haste, found no clear cause. His notes, later preserved in fragments, read, "Symptoms irregular. Neither pox nor rot as I know it. Animals perish swift, as if seized by unseen hand. Suspect poison, though no evidence it." Troughs, the suggestion of poison was enough to spark suspicion. Families began to guard their pens through the night, lanterns glowing at the edges of fields. Neighbors eyed one another with quiet mistrust. If the beasts were being poisoned, who would do such a thing? The Harkers, already suspected after Sarah's disappearance, bore the brunt of whispered blame. Others insisted the land itself was cursed, that something in the soil or river carried rot. The Reverend, from his pulpit, declared the plague to be punishment for disobedience. He compared the dying cattle to sacrifices, necessary offerings that proved Eden's worthiness. The contrast could not have been sharper. Man's dominion over animals, a gift they had celebrated upon arrival, had become a cruel theatre of weakness. The very beasts meant to sustain them now mocked their efforts. Each death, another reminder that survival was slipping away. The sound of lowing cattle once promised milk and strength. Now it signaled another loss, another funeral pyre on the edge of the settlement. Among the artifacts left from this period is a letter written in code, discovered years later among county archives. Its author is uncertain, though style suggests it belonged to one of the Lowell brothers. Deciphered, it reads, "I know this is not illness. The marks at the troughs are made by hand. If I speak it aloud, I will be next. Better to write it and pray it is found." Such a note, hidden rather than spoken, reveals the depth of fear. To accuse openly was to invite ruin, yet silence only deepened suspicion. As animals died and food stores shrank further, families began to barter loyalty for scraps. The Reverend's granary, still holding reserves from the previous year, became the last reliable source. Those who prayed longest, who confessed deepest, found their bowls filled. Those who resisted or questioned received less. Hunger pressed hard, but mistrust pressed harder. Eden, once imagined as a community of equals, was becoming a place where every family watched the other, waiting for signs of guilt, or waiting for the next calamity to strike. By the time the last of the goats collapsed in the dust, the settlers no longer saw these disasters as isolated strokes of misfortune. A child gone without a trace, a mill consumed in fire without cause, and now the herds rotting in their pens. It formed a chain too deliberate to be dismissed. Sheriff Wilkes, worn by sleepless nights and constant appeals from fearful families, gathered the men in what remained of the council. He laid out the ledger of incidents on the chapel table, its pages blackened by soot from the mill fire, the ink smudged but still legible. "First the girl," he said, voice low. "Then the mill. Now the beasts. This is no accident. Something binds these." His words were plain, and for the first time, no one argued. Yet his authority was fraying. Many of the men looked past him to Reverend Moore, who stood silent at first, one hand resting on his worn Bible. When he finally spoke, he declared that the pattern was not the work of man at all, but a divine testing of their covenant. "Do you think Eden is ours to keep without trial?" he asked. "The Lord weighs us in his balance. Each loss is his measure." The contrast was stark. Wilkes sought earthly cause, tracks in snow, signs of poison. The Reverend spoke of invisible trial, faith proved in suffering. Between them, the families were torn. A visiting doctor, persuaded to remain a few more weeks after examining the livestock, attempted to give shape to the unknown. He drew crude diagrams in his notes, speculating on tainted water or molds in the grain. His words brought little comfort. Science without remedy sounded hollow against the Reverend's thunder. One path offered rational explanations with no answers. The other offered answers that demanded obedience without question. The unease among the families grew unbearable. Children were no longer allowed to stray, even in daylight. Husbands and wives quarreled in hushed tones, some insisting they should abandon the valley, others warning that to leave was to forsake both land and covenant. In private journals, despair began to seep through. Ruth Ellison's surviving fragment reads, "We are pressed on every side. To stay is to starve, to leave is to sin. The Reverend tells us doubt is death. I fear doubt, but I fear obedience too." In this atmosphere of tension, the chapel bells tolled longer each night. What had begun as brief prayers stretched into hours of confession and hymn, Reverend Moore's voice rising over sobs and whispered admissions. The disasters, once treated as separate misfortunes, were now bound into a single narrative. Eden was being weighed, judged, purified. And while Wilkes still scratched notes into his ledger, searching for patterns of cause and effect, more and more of the settlement leaned toward the Reverend's explanation. It was in this moment of mounting dread that the fracture widened. Some began to suspect, that only absolute devotion could shield their families from further loss. Others whispered of leaving under cover of night. But all agreed on one truth: what plagued Eden was no longer chance. A pattern had emerged, and it would not relent. And here the tension crests, as it once did for them and now does for us. Would you have stayed in Eden, clinging to the Reverend's promise of salvation, or would you have taken your chances in the wilderness beyond the ridges? Nearly a decade after Eden had collapsed into silence, a single voice broke through the layers of dust and sealed ledgers. It belonged to Margaret Dunn, widow of Thomas Dunn, who was among the 11 founding men. Her testimony surfaced during a county inquiry in 1837, and though heavily redacted in the official record, fragments remain. The surviving deposition is stark, written in a clerk's stiff hand, but it carries beneath the formality the weight of a woman who had endured the valley and lived to tell of it. She described the steady unraveling of trust, how one by one the families turned from neighbors into rivals, then into enemies. It was not hunger alone that killed Eden, she said, according to the transcript. It was the way we ceased to look one another in the eye. Every kindness was counted as debt. Every silence was judged as guilt. The Reverend's voice grew louder, and ours grew smaller. Her words, though surrounded by long black bars of redaction, capture a truth more piercing than any ledger. The contrast in her testimony is striking. On one hand, she remembered children running barefoot through the summer grass, laughter rising above the river. On the other, she recalled nights when doors were bolted and families sang hymns not out of joy but out of fear that silence would mark them as disobedient. She spoke of the chapel as both refuge and prison, a place where warmth and bread could be found, but also where suspicion was, sharpened into sermons that set families against each other. One passage, crossed out in the county copy but later reconstructed from Margaret's own papers, tells of the winter after the mill burned. We kept to the pews, afraid to sleep in our cabins. My youngest cried from hunger, but when I asked for more, the Reverend said God's portion was sufficient. I began to believe that God's portion was to see us wither. The artifact of her words stands as one of the only direct accounts from inside Eden, more powerful in its incompleteness than if it had survived whole. Her deposition was not widely circulated. The county magistrate, wary of fueling rumors of witchcraft or institutional failure, sealed most of it in archives. The public record reduced it to a line: witness attests to hardship, disputes, eventual abandonment. Yet the fragments preserved by her descendants reveal far more. Not abandonment but collapse, not hardship but terror. To read Margaret Dunn's words now is to feel the tension between what was officially recorded and what was lived. The ink of the clerk speaks in detached tones. The widow's voice beneath it trembles with grief and rage. Between them lies the silence of those who did not survive. And it is that silence, more than the redactions, that reminds us how fragile truth becomes when institutions choose what is remembered and what is erased. The spring after Margaret Dunn's testimony would later recall, Eden was no longer a settlement bound by shared purpose. It had become a camp of factions, each shrinking into itself, watching the others with suspicion. Sheriff Samuel Wilkes, who had once been respected as the quiet arbiter of disputes, found his authority eroded day by day. When the mill had burned, he had taken the lead in organizing searches and rationing what remained. After the livestock plague, he had drawn maps of fields and streams, determined to track contamination. But each effort ended the same way, with unanswered questions, with no clear culprit, and with more whispers that his hand was too weak to keep the valley safe. The shift became clear one evening when he called a gathering to address new reports of theft from granaries. Fewer than half the families came, and those who did sat in silence, heads lowered. When Wilkes read aloud the names of those accused, no one defended themselves. Instead, all eyes turned toward Reverend Moore, who stood in his usual place by the chapel door. Moore did not speak at first, letting the silence deepen, until at last he declared that law was not enough to root out sin, that only confession before God could cleanse the community From that moment, the Council of Settlers ceased to matter. The sheriff's ledger grew thin, its entries reduced to brief notes. Disputes no longer brought to me. Families seek judgment from pulpit. Order slipping. The contrast was sharp. The sheriff embodied the promise of earthly order, of rules that could be written and enforced by men. But in the face of inexplicable disasters, many found his explanations empty. The Reverend, with his thunderous voice and steady gaze, offered a different order, one that made suffering meaningful, that transformed fear into proof of chosenness. Where Wilkes demanded evidence, Moore demanded obedience. And in that climate of despair, obedience was easier to give. Rumors spread that Wilkes considered leaving Eden altogether, that he had sent word to the county for assistance. If such letters were written, none survived. What remains instead is the testimony of Martha Caldwell. Preserved in her journal, "The sheriff is alone. He walks the rows of cabins, but men close their doors. Only the Reverend is welcome now. Even the children cry for him when sick. It is as though the law never followed us." Here, her words capture the loneliness of a man tasked with maintaining order in a place that no longer believed in it. By midsummer, Wilkes had withdrawn almost entirely. His cabin stood at the far end of the clearing, lantern dark most nights. Some whispered he had lost his faith. Others that he had gone mad keeping his ledgers while the valley burned around him. The Reverend, meanwhile, presided over longer and harsher gatherings in the chapel. Families who once sought fairness from the sheriff now lined the pews, waiting for their sins to be named aloud, waiting to prove their devotion. The erosion of civil authority was complete. Where once two centers of gravity had vied for the settlement, law and church, only one remained. The chapel bell, rung each night, replaced the sheriff's call for order. And in that tolling sound lay a deeper truth. Eden no longer belonged to the 11 families who built it. It belonged to the Reverend, and to the God he claimed was speaking through him. The Reverend's journal was not meant for the eyes of his congregation. Yet fragments survive, tucked into county records as exhibits and later copied by hand into church archives. Before being sealed, bound in worn leather, its pages carried more than sermons. It bore witness to a man's mind, bending beneath the weight of fear and power. The handwriting was precise at first, each line measured, as though the very act of order in script reflected divine clarity. But as the years passed, the ink grew darker, strokes heavier. Words pressed into the page until they nearly tore the paper. One early entry spoke of simple devotion. The flock gathers in warmth, though storms press us hard. Their faith is balm, their songs proof of our endurance. A year later, his tone shifted. The child's disappearance was no chance. The Lord sifteth his people as wheat, and not all shall remain. By the time the mill had burned, his words had taken on a fevered cadence. Ashes purify. Fire is his tool. Better a mill lost than a soul untried. These writings, later read aloud in inquiry, chilled listeners who expected piety and found obsession. The most disturbing passages emerged during the plague among the animals. In one, the Reverend wrote, "The beasts fall as sacrifice, their cries like incense rising to heaven. If men will not confess, the Lord will scourge their fields until they bow. I am his rod and his witness." Here, the contrast between Scripture as comfort and Scripture as weapon is undeniable. What had once guided the weary became justification for control. His private conviction that God's will was expressed through suffering seeped into every sermon he preached. And the families, desperate for meaning in their losses, clung to his certainty even as it bound them tighter to his authority. The journal also reveals a darker preoccupation with purity. He noted which families were most devout, which showed wavering eyes, which withheld tithes of spirit. Names were listed beside these. Remarks: Bennett, Price, Harker, with notes like unrepentant, must be chastened. It is unclear whether these notations ever translated into direct action. But within months, those families would suffer greater hardship than others. Their rations thinner, their children overlooked when food was scarce. Sheriff Wilkes, still clinging to his role, once confronted the Reverend about these writings. A surviving margin note in the ledger reads simply, "Moore keeps account of sin as if it were coin. He speaks of chastening, yet who chastens him?" That question unanswered then lingers still. For the settlers of Eden, however, the journal was invisible. They heard only the words preached aloud, words that grew harsher, more insistent, demanding sacrifice and silence in exchange for survival. The Reverend's private pages, preserved only by chance, expose the architecture of his mind, a scaffolding of scripture bent into a cage, where every disaster was proof of providence, and every doubt was treachery. In those pages lies the evidence of how a leader once trusted transformed trial into doctrine and grief into leverage. The church had become the sole authority, and the Reverend's journal shows how deliberately that authority was shaped not by accident, but by conviction that suffering itself was holy. The winter of 1833 is remembered in Eden only through fragments, broken entries in the sheriff's ledger, pages of the Reverend's increasingly frenzied journal, and a handful of letters written by the Caldwell family before their disappearance. Together, these artifacts outline the settlement's first direct confrontation with itself. It began quietly, with whispers that certain families were hoarding food while others starved. When snow fell early and deep, suspicions hardened into accusations, and accusations soon carried the weight of verdicts delivered from the pulpit. On the third Sunday of Advent, the Reverend called the congregation to remain in the chapel after the hymn. He ordered the doors barred. By lantern light, he announced that sin had taken root in Eden, and until it was purged, the Lord would continue to punish the valley. The names of 3 families were read aloud: the Prices, the Harkers, and the Bennets. They were summoned to stand before their neighbors, their children trembling beside them. Witnesses later recalled that no evidence of theft or deceit was presented, only the Reverend's insistence that God had revealed their guilt in prayer. The contrast between sanctuary and tribunal was sharp. The chapel, once a place of song and comfort against the winter winds, had become a chamber of judgment. The very pews that once held neighbors side by side now served as barriers, dividing the accused from the accusing. Outside, snow piled high against the windows. Inside, voices rose in forced amends, as though agreeing could shield each family from being next. A letter written by Martha Caldwell to her sister captures the atmosphere. "We dared not breathe lest silence mark us as doubters. The children wept, but no one dared hush them. When the Reverend spoke of fire, I feared he meant it truly." She went on to note that the accused families were ordered to surrender what remained of their provisions, their tools, and even their bedding to the chapel. Within a week, the Prices and Harkers abandoned their cabins entirely, vanishing into the snowbound woods. Sheriff Wilkes recorded the event with chilling brevity. Deck 21, counsel supplanted. Judgment from pulpit, families gone. His words, spare and weary, acknowledged the collapse of civil authority more starkly than any sermon could. Where once disputes were mediated, they were now prosecuted under the guise of divine command. By the end of that winter, only 8 families remained. The others had fled into the wilderness or perished trying. For those who stayed, the message was clear. Survival in Eden no longer depended on skill, labor, or law. It depended on obedience. The Reverend's power was not just spiritual, it was material, rooted in control of food, fire, and the fragile sense of belonging that kept despair at bay. What began as a community founded on shared labor had, by that winter, hardened into a church state with no room for dissent. The confrontation in the chapel was not the last, but it was the first moment where fear outweighed kinship, and where faith, once a bond of hope, became the instrument of division. The snow melted months later, but the memory of that night remained like frost upon every door. The following summer should have brought relief, but instead it revealed the second great fracture in Eden, the river that had once been there. Lifeline began to change. Its waters, once clear and fast, grew sluggish, tinted with an odd reddish hue after heavy rains. Fish floated belly up against the banks, and children who waded in came home with rashes on their legs. Some believed it was the soil upstream, leached of minerals by fire and frost. Others whispered that it was a sign that the valley itself was rejecting them. At first, Sheriff Wilkes attempted to investigate. His ledger records crude tests, water boiled in iron pots, samples stored in jars, comparisons made between river water and melted snow. His notes grew increasingly frustrated. No certainty. Cannot prove cause. Reverend says plague of Nile. The Reverend, seizing the moment, declared from the pulpit that the corruption of the river was God's judgment upon hidden sin. He warned that any family who drank without blessing was inviting death. Buckets of water were carried into the chapel. Prayers murmured over them, and only then were they deemed fit to drink. The contrast could not have been sharper. For Wilkes, the river's decline was a physical problem, something to be explained by nature, measured and tested, perhaps endured until balance returned. For the Reverend, it was a moral riddle, proof of corruption among his flock. And as fear deepened, the congregation leaned toward the man who gave certainty, however harsh, rather than the one who offered only doubt. An entry from Margaret Dunn's personal papers illuminates the atmosphere. When my daughter grew sick, I boiled snow for her to drink. The Reverend called it rebellion. Neighbors turned their eyes from me, though they once were my friends. I began to fear my own hearthfire would betray me. Her words reveal how easily survival practices, once shared without question, became grounds for suspicion. The summer confrontation came to a head when two families, the Kleins and the Harpers, refused to present their water for blessing. They argued that the river's sickness was natural, not divine. Within a week, both families reported severe illness. Whether by chance or from spoiled food, no one could say. The Reverend preached that this was proof, his voice echoing through the rafters. The Lord hath struck them that doubted. Shall ye follow their folly? What followed was the second great exodus. The Harpers attempted to flee, leaving in the dead of night with what little they could carry. Their abandoned cabin was found days later, ransacked and empty. Of the Kleins, nothing remained but a single letter, never sent, discovered decades later in the walls of the chapel. We will not bend our knees to fear dressed as faith. If we perish, it will not be as captives. By the end of that summer, Eden was down to 6 families. The river, once the heart of their survival, had become a dividing line between those who obeyed and those who resisted, between natural explanations and supernatural certainty. The water itself seemed to mirror the state of the community, once vibrant, now darkened, poisoned, and slowly strangling the life it had promised to sustain. The third and most harrowing incident arrived in the autumn of 1834, when the fields themselves seemed to betray the settlers. The harvest, meager after years of strain, produced ears of corn mottled black and stalks withered before their time. Wheat crumbled in the hand, and what little rye could be gathered bore a bitter taste. Families who had stored seed for years opened their barrels to find rot, as though decay had seeped into the wood itself. Hunger, which had been a companion before, now loomed as master. Sheriff Wilkes attempted to account for the failure, recording the weather, noting late frosts and a summer of heavy storms. His ledger entry for September reads, soil exhausted, seed corrupted, natural causes. But his voice no longer carried weight. The Reverend declared instead that the land had been cursed by deceit, that hidden sin had defiled the very ground. In his sermons he spoke of Eden as a second Canaan, promised but profaned, and that only through sacrifice could the covenant be restored. The contrast between natural explanation and spiritual condemnation reached its peak in those weeks. For Wilkes, the land was poor, the science crude, but the answer was still rooted in earth and toil. For Moore, the Reverend, the answer was blood. Witnesses later testified that he began speaking of the first fruits, not as crops, but as the lives of those who had resisted obedience. His words, recorded in a surviving sermon draft, ring with chilling certainty. If the field is to yield, the stone of rebellion must be struck. The Lord's plowshare spares no root of pride. Fear turned quickly to action. Families gathered what little grain remained and laid it at the chapel steps. Mothers carried their sick children forward for blessings, whispering prayers through tears. The Reverend's authority grew absolute. Those who hesitated were marked as doubters, and neighbors began to turn against them. One account, preserved in a letter smuggled to the county by a traveling peddler, described the night when the Bennets' cabin was stormed. They accused them of hiding wheat. I saw only straw. Still, they dragged the father to the chapel. His wife's cries were drowned by the hymn. The Bennets vanished from the record after that night. No grave was marked, no cabin left standing. Sheriff Wilkes's ledger contains only a single line for October. Bennet family gone. Record unclear. Cannot oppose. His resignation on the page is as haunting as the absence it notes. By winter, only 5 families remained, and their unity was bound not by trust, but by fear of the pulpit. The harvest had not improved, but obedience had deepened, as if submission itself could conjure sustenance from barren soil. The Reverend's journal from that season carried a single, triumphant phrase repeated across pages. The dross is burned away. What had once been a colony of 11 families working the land together was now a dwindling enclave clinging to a church that demanded sacrifice in exchange for survival. The harvest, blackened and spoiled, symbolized more than famine. It was the final severing of Eden's original covenant of labor and community. From that autumn on, the settlement was no longer a dream of prosperity. It had become a crucible of faith and fear, where only the most obedient could hope to endure. By 1835, Eden was scarcely recognizable as the settlement once mapped out by the 11 founding families. The cabins still stood, but most were empty, their doors swinging open in the wind, hearths long gone cold. Paths that once carried neighbors with baskets of bread or tools for barter were overgrown with weeds, leading now only to silence. The center of life was no longer the common green or the riverside, but the chapel alone. Each evening the bell tolled, and the remaining families gathered as though compelled by something stronger than choice. Within those walls, the Reverend's voice filled the air like smoke, clinging to every surface, every breath. The hymns had grown slower, more mournful, no longer songs of praise but of lament. His sermons no longer dwelt on hope or redemption, but on trials, punishment, and the purging of sin through obedience. He warned constantly of hidden enemies, of unseen corruption, of the danger of questioning the divine order. Doubt itself had become a crime. The contrast between the chapel and the cabins was stark. The homes, once symbols of independence and family, decayed into ruins, while the church stood sturdier than ever, its roof patched, its stores fuller than those of any household. Food was rationed not by family need, but by the Reverend's judgment. Firewood was distributed from the chapel steps. Survival no longer came from labor in the fields or skill at the forge. It came only through proximity to the pulpit. Artifacts from this period confirm the shift. One surviving inventory of provisions, kept by the Reverend himself, lists barrels of corn-smoked venison, apples dried in cloth, candles, and medicinal herbs. At the bottom of the page is a note in the same hand: all gifts of the faithful, entrusted to the Lord's house, yet testimony from later. Inquiries suggest these gifts were less offerings than confiscations, taken from families under pressure to prove their loyalty. Margaret Dunn's letters from this season capture the suffocating atmosphere. We go not to church for God, but for bread. My children's eyes are sunken, yet they must sing when told. I fear the Lord sees less of us than the Reverend does. Her words reveal the inversion at the heart of Eden. What had been conceived as a refuge of faith had become a system of control, where faith was measured by compliance and compliance ensured survival. Sheriff Wilkes by then was a ghost within the community. His ledger, once filled with daily entries, dwindled to sparse lines. The last legible note from 1835 reads, "Order no longer mine. Law is pulpit." My voice hollow. He lived still in his cabin, but no one visited. His authority had evaporated, leaving him a bystander to the consolidation of the Reverend's power. By the end of that year, Eden was reduced to 5 families, each bound in fear to the rhythms of the chapel bell. The settlement that had begun as an experiment in cooperation and hope was now a church-state in miniature. Its citizens both worshippers and prisoners. What was left of Eden lived only in hymns that sounded less like songs of faith and more like dirges for the world they had lost. By the spring of 1836, the valley itself seemed to mirror the decay within. Eden, the forest pressed closer to the clearing, as though reclaiming what men had once cut back. Birds no longer nested near the cabins, and even the river ran quieter. Its current dulled, as though reluctant to flow past a place so burdened. Within the settlement, only 4 families remained, each gaunt, their children thinner, their eyes shadowed with a constant fear. The Reverend alone seemed to gain strength, his sermons swelling in fervor, his frame unbowed by the hunger that gnawed at others. It was in this season that rumors of darker rituals began to surface. No official record describes them directly, yet scattered testimonies from survivors and descendants whisper of gatherings held not on the Sabbath, but in the black hours before dawn. The chapel bell rang at times when no service was scheduled, and men, women, and even children were summoned inside. Windows glowed with flickering light, and neighbors reported the sound of chanting that did not match any known hymn. Some claimed animals disappeared from pens and were never seen again. Others said the Reverend demanded offerings not of food, but of silence, secrets confessed and sealed, binding families more tightly in fear. The contrast between daylight and night in Eden became symbolic of its final descent. By day, the settlement was a hollow village, cabins collapsing, fields untended, smoke rising only from the chapel chimney. By night, that same chapel blazed with firelight, its windows glowing like watchful eyes, the air filled with voices repeating words none dared later to recall. Where once faith had been a comfort against the wilderness, it had become the wilderness itself, vast, consuming and inescapable. One artifact survives from this period, a torn page of the Reverend's journal, preserved in the county archive, though marked as unverified. The ink is jagged, scrawled as though in haste. The covenant must be sealed in flesh. The Lord will not suffer lukewarm hearts. Better few and pure than many and corrupt, if genuine. It suggests that his vision for Eden had transformed entirely, not a sanctuary for families, but a crucible where suffering was proof of holiness, and survival itself required sacrifice. Margaret Dunn's recollections, recorded years later, confirmed the atmosphere of dread. She wrote, "We feared to sleep. The bell could sound at any hour and we must go. To remain in our cabins was to mark ourselves apart. Even the children ceased to cry when roused, as if they too knew silence was safer." Her words capture the collapse of normal life, the erosion of rhythms of work, rest, and community into a single cycle of summons and obedience. Sheriff Wilkes, though still alive, had vanished almost entirely from the life of Eden. Witnesses last saw him standing at the edge of the clearing, watching the chapel with an expression of hollow resignation. His ledger ends abruptly with the line, "This is no law I know." After that, his fate is unknown. By summer, Eden no longer resembled a settlement at all. It was a husk circling one building, one voice, one will. The dream of 11 families had been stripped away, replaced by a single congregation bound by fear, ritual, and the unyielding certainty of their pastor. The church no longer served the people. The people existed only to serve the church. In that inversion lay the death of Eden's original covenant and the seed of its final collapse. The breaking point came in the winter of 1836, when what remained of Eden turned upon itself in an event later remembered only as the night of the bell. Snow had fallen heavily, sealing the cabins under drifts and silencing the forest with its weight. Food was nearly gone. The last barrels of grain had been emptied weeks before, and hunting yielded little more than thin hares and carrion birds. Families huddled by weak fires, children coughing, mothers hollow-eyed. Yet when the chapel bell rang at midnight, its sound rose clear and commanding through the storm, pulling every soul once more into the Reverend's orbit. Inside the chapel, the air was close with the stink of damp wool and smoke. The Reverend stood at the altar, a lantern at his side, casting sharp shadows against the walls. He announced that the Lord had revealed to him a final cause for Eden's suffering. A family among them harbored rebellion in their hearts, poisoning the covenant with their doubt. He named the Duns. Gasps broke the silence, for Margaret and her children had been among the most faithful. Rarely absent from service, their voices steady in hymn. Yet the Reverend's voice brooked no denial. The contrast between past kinship and present terror was stark. Neighbors who once shared bread, with the Duns now shifted away from them on the benches, as though physical distance could shield them from guilt by association. Margaret protested weakly at first, then with rising desperation. She begged the congregation to remember her loyalty, to see her hunger and grief as no different from their own. But the Reverend raised his hand, and the murmurs fell silent. His judgment was final. Artifacts from this night are scarce, yet one fragment survives. A scrap of paper found years later in the ruins of the chapel, scrawled in hurried hand, likely by Margaret herself. It reads only, "The bell is a summons to death. Pray for my children." The words are smudged, the ink blurred, but their meaning is unmistakable. Witnesses recalled that the Dun children were pulled from their mother's arms, taken toward the altar as hymns were sung loud enough to drown their cries. Margaret herself was dragged into the snow, her voice carrying into the night as she pleaded for mercy. What became of her afterward is uncertain. Some say she escaped into the forest, barefoot and half-mad, never to return. Others believe she was buried in an unmarked grave beyond the clearing. The Reverend's journal for that night offers no clarity. Only a single line, "The Lord hath sifted his flock." Sheriff Wilkes did not appear. Whether he was dead, fled, or simply too broken to intervene, no one could later say. His absence sealed the transformation of Eden. The last vestige of earthly law had vanished, leaving only the rule of the pulpit. By dawn, the chapel stood in silence, its lanterns extinguished. Of the 4 families that had entered, only 3 emerged, their faces pale, their steps slow as though burdened by shame and fear. The snow bore marks of struggle, trampled into red-streaked ice, but no one spoke of it. The bell did not ring again that day. In that night, Eden ceased to be a settlement of families. It became a congregation bound by complicity, where silence was survival and memory itself was a kind of guilt. What the Reverend had forged was no longer faith. It was dominion sealed in blood and frost. The spring thaw of 1837 revealed what the snow had concealed, and with it came the final unraveling of Eden. The cabins, once proud symbols of each family's endurance, sagged inward as if crushed by the weight of emptiness. Doors creaked in the wind, roofs collapsed under rot, and hearthstones lay cold. Of the original 11 families, only 3 now remained within sight of the chapel, and even they were shadows of themselves, gaunt, silent, and bound together less by hope than by the fear of being the next to vanish. It was during this season that outsiders first set foot in Eden again. A county surveyor, dispatched to map the region for taxation purposes, recorded a curious entry in his field notes. Settlement Eden, population uncertain. No welcome given. All approached through chapel. Families appeared diminished, fields untended, church alone intact. His words, dry and observational, contrast sharply with the dread described in the surviving testimonies of the families themselves. To the surveyor, Eden was simply failing. To its residents, it was consuming. Artifacts from this time emphasize the narrowing of life to the church alone. A surviving ration log written in the Reverend's hand lists only 3 households by name beneath the chapel's heading. All food, tools, and cloth were inventoried as belonging to God's store, distributed solely at his discretion. The once proud ledgers of families like the Caldwells and Harpers disappeared entirely, replaced by a single, centralized record of dependence. The cabins were no longer homes. They were way stations where the faithful endured between summons to the pews. The contrast between presence and absence became the defining feature of the settlement. Where once there had been laughter of children, now silence lingered. Where fields had once promised abundance, weeds grew unchecked. where 11 families had once signed their names to a covenant of mutual labor. Only the church remained as the physical and moral center. Even the grave markers that dotted the edge of the clearing seemed fewer, some toppled, some erased, as if time itself was conspiring to erase all but the chapel. Margaret Dunn's fate remained uncertain, but whispers of her survival began to circulate beyond the valley. A letter held in county archives, written by a peddler who passed near Eden that spring, tells of a woman ragged and wild-eyed, encountered in the woods. She spoke of bells in the night and children taken from her. Though the man dismissed her as mad, her story aligned too closely with the fragments preserved in testimony to be ignored. Her very existence became a living indictment of what Eden had become. By the summer of that year, the county authorities had received enough troubling reports to dispatch investigators. What they found confirmed the surveyor's observations. A settlement reduced to ruin, its survivors unwilling or unable to speak freely, their lives wholly bound to the chapel. Sheriff Wilkes was nowhere to be found, his cabin abandoned, his ledger left unfinished on a table. The Reverend alone received the investigators, insisting all was well, that the community thrived in spiritual strength, if not in worldly wealth. Yet the evidence spoke louder than his words. Only the church stood whole, tended with care, its bell rope frayed from constant use. Around it lay the husks of homes, and the silence of lives extinguished or fled. Eden had become a ghost village where faith had outlived the faithful, where stone and sermon endured, while flesh and kinship failed. In that silence, investigators understood the final truth. Eden was no longer a settlement of families at all. It was a monument to one man's will, standing in defiance of the dream that had built it. The investigators who entered Eden in the autumn of 1837 found themselves caught between duty and dread. Officially, their charge was simple: to assess whether the land could still be taxed, whether its occupants intended to remain, and whether county authority ought to intervene in disputes that had gone unreported for years. Yet what they encountered unsettled them far beyond questions of law or property. They recorded 3 families still present, though their exact number was uncertain, faces pale, eyes downcast, children silent in ways no children should be. When asked for names, one woman gave hers only in a whisper, as though speaking it aloud might invite punishment. The Reverend greeted the investigators at the chapel door. Contemporary notes describe him as calm, even gracious, offering bread and water before any questions were asked. His words were practiced, his tone measured. He explained that Eden had chosen to live apart from worldly distractions, that losses from disease and weather had winnowed their numbers but strengthened their faith. The Lord builds stronger houses with fewer stones, he said, a phrase repeated across multiple reports. On paper, it was a statement of resilience. In the investigators' recollections, it sounded more like justification for absence. The contrast between surface order and underlying decay was stark. The chapel was clean, its pews polished, its lanterns burning bright. Yet beyond its walls, cabins leaned and sagged, fields lay barren, and smoke rose from no chimneys. The church seemed to flourish even as the settlement rotted, and the more the Reverend spoke of God's providence, the clearer it became that survival in Eden was tethered to the chapel alone. Artifacts preserved from this visit reinforce that impression. One investigator copied passages from the Reverend's ration log, noting its odd phrasing. 1 loaf to the house of Dunn, 2 measures to the house of Klein, 3 candles to the house of Price. All others, none. The ledger framed each gift as a blessing, not as distribution, further blurring the line between spiritual authority and material control. Another investigator described a wall in the chapel lined with scraps of parchment, each bearing a single name. Some were crossed through, others left untouched. When asked their purpose, the Reverend replied simply, "They are the flock." The families themselves gave little testimony. When questioned, they deferred to their pastor, their voices thin and hesitant. A few fragments were overheard, one child muttering that the bell called them in the dark, a woman whispering that to leave is to die, These utterances, though quickly silenced, left investigators uneasy. Still, lacking explicit evidence of crime, they could not intervene directly. They filed their report with the county, noting Eden as diminished, yet functional, with a final line that betrayed more than bureaucratic detachment. Recommend no further inquiries. The place is not sound. The Reverend's journal from that season, later seized and sealed, contains a chilling parallel entry. Strangers came among us, blind to holiness. They saw only ruin where the Lord has planted strength. Let them leave. Eden is not for them. By the time authorities considered a second inspection, winter had closed the valley roads. When spring arrived, and word came that even fewer families remained, Eden was no longer a matter of taxes or property lines. It had become a question of survival, whether anyone inside could yet be saved, or whether the church itself would be all that endured. When county authorities finally returned to Eden in 1838, they found almost nothing left of the settlement that 11 families had once carved from the wilderness. The cabins stood empty, some collapsed into heaps of timber, others stripped bare of doors and shutters as though abandoned in haste. The fields were a tangle of weeds and thistles, the fences fallen, the paths erased by rain and time. Yet the chapel remained. Its walls stood firm, its roof intact, the bell still hanging in the steeple. Inside, dust lay thick upon the pews, but the altar was clean, as though tended even in absence. No living soul greeted them. No voices rose in hymn, no smoke curled from hearths. The Reverend himself was gone, his fate unknown. Only his journal remained, left open upon the altar as if awaiting a final reader. The last entry, written in a trembling hand, offered no confession or explanation, only a cryptic line: "The church endures, for it is the body. The families were but flesh." With those words, the valley's mystery hardened into myth. Whether the families fled, perished, or were consumed by the weight of obedience, the record does not say. The contrast between presence and absence defined the investigators' final report. All that remained of Eden's people was absence, empty cabins, missing graves, the silence of names crossed out in ledgers. Yet the church endured, her presence so complete it seemed almost to erase the memory of the families who had built it. What had begun as a covenant among neighbors ended as a monument to a single voice and the structure that housed it. Artifacts sealed afterward included the Reverend's journals, the sheriff's unfinished ledger, and fragments of testimony from survivors like Margaret. These documents were locked away in county archives, stamped with warnings not to be released without permission, lest rumors of fanaticism stain the region's reputation. Officially, Eden was recorded as a failed settlement undone by famine and disease. Unofficially, whispers of bells in the night, of forced confessions, and of families erased persisted, carried by travelers and descendants. The epilogue of Eden is not only historical, but philosophical. It forces the question: what endures when human communities collapse? Is it stone doctrine or memory? In Eden, homes crumbled, children vanished, and fields rotted. Yet the chapel remained, untouched by time, in a way that feels less like preservation than accusation. To walk among its ruins even now is to feel the weight of that endurance, to hear in silence the echo of bells, to imagine hymns sung as dirges, to sense the thin line between sanctuary and prison. The story of Eden is not a parable of survival, but of surrender. How hope can curdle into fear, how faith can be weaponized, how institutions may outlive the people they claim to serve. The families built Eden, but only the church remained. And the final question it leaves us with, one that history cannot answer, is whether the true failure lay in their hunger, their obedience, or in the silence of those who came too late.